It is now my job to introduce Bill Browne. Bill Browne is Director of the Democracy and Accountability Program at the Australia Institute, a think tank we really like. He will reveal new polling conducted by the Australia Institute on the issue of government funding of chaplains in public schools. Interesting. Welcome.
Thank you everyone for having me. As mentioned, I represent the Australia Institute and we conducted some polling on school chaplains. We asked 5 questions about the National Student Wellbeing Program, which you've just been introduced to if you hadn't heard of it already, and we did that in October, November of this year, so it's about as current as you could possibly get. We did that in collaboration with the Rationalist Society of Australia, and we're very grateful for all their assistance. The research is public on our website now, so I'd encourage you to check it out if you're interested in seeing it in more detail. I'm necessarily presenting a potted version of what we found, and there's a lot more you can dig around in the data there in terms of how people by gender, age group, voting intention or state of residence split on all these different questions. And I thought in a group of free thinkers and skeptics, I should be very clear about the rigour of the polling that we conducted and kind of what it's based on. So it's an online survey through our panel provider, Dynata. So we're going to people in general. They're not opting into a particular survey. They don't know ahead of time what it involves. We're trying to get as close to a sample of the general Australian adult population as possible. And that involved a nationally representative sample of over 1,000 people, plus a boost in South Australia to get more statistically significant results there. And what that sample of 1,000 plus gives us is a margin of error of about 3%, which means these results are pretty close to what you'd get if you were able to go more broadly, if you got more than 1,000 people. There's only that slight variance there. And as mentioned, we collected demographic information and voting intention, and it's conducted to polling council standards. So we disclose exactly the questions we asked. There weren't questions asked ahead of time to skew people's answers or anything like that. You've got the details you need to assess it. And as mentioned, it was about the Student Wellbeing Program, federal government funding to employ chaplains or student wellbeing officers, with that element of the requirement of religious endorsement for a chaplain despite nominally having a job that is not a religious role. We introduced respondents to the survey to the program with a kind of short neutral description of how it operates, and then asked if they knew about this program. And the vast majority, over 7 in 10, did not. They hadn't heard of the program. And even there, another 10% didn't know if they knew of the program. So you're looking at only about 1 in 5 who can definitively answer that they're familiar with the program. We did find that younger people were more likely to have heard of it than older people, which makes sense if you imagine they're recently out of school, are more likely to have come across it that way. But having heard of the program, being told about how it operates, what we find is that it does not attract general support. We asked the general principle of whether there should be no religious requirement for public school jobs, and there you get 3 in 4 in support of that proposition. So in general terms, people accept the principle that federal money shouldn't be funding positions with a religious threshold. We then asked in 2 different ways, question about the idea of kind of public school roles being based on qualifications rather than a religious endorsement, or including a religious endorsement. And there we get strong support, 2 in 3 or 66%. It's then good polling practice to ask that in the opposite, to see if that kind of teases out differences in response. And you do actually see something of a change there. When we ask people kind of the preposition phrased in the opposite direction, pastoral care workers should be endorsed by a religious group, you still get more disagreeing than agreeing, but we see the gap between them fall a bit. And that might be because of the removal of the idea of qualifications from that question. So it might be a lesson there in terms of advocacy and communication to emphasise the idea that you may want roles that are based on qualifications. People respond well to the idea that the people who are providing pastoral care to students are being assessed on that basis. We then put to respondents the ACT's model. The ACT participates in the same system as other states and territories, but it's set a separate policy, which is it requires its public schools to hire pastoral care workers directly. Now, as I understand, the principals are still able to advertise for a chaplain rather than a secular position, but it places the onus on the schools to do so. And in practice, in that position, few, if any, public school principals are willing to do that. They advertise for a secular position instead. And what we find there is majority support among Australians, 56%, for adopting the ACT model in their own state or territory. So there's a clear alternative there. It also attracts majority support in each of the larger states. We didn't get a large enough sample in Tasmania, but otherwise you can see a majority across the states. And I think it's also notable that you get very few people opposing the idea of this ACT policy. Those in support outnumber those opposed over 3 to 1. And it's actually a large don't know, not sure chunk that is kind of the second runner-up, or is the runner-up there. So there's a lesson there, I think, in terms of communication and advocacy. There's a large group of people who could be convinced. So, in summary, what we find from the polling research is that most people don't know that federal money funds jobs requiring religious endorsement. When they do find out, they don't support public school roles requiring a religious endorsement, and the ACT alternative of direct employment by public schools has majority support. So thank you very much for your time. As I mentioned, it's on the website if you want to check it out. I also have a few physical copies, and please do get in touch if you have any questions or comments. Thank you.